Aloha! Welcome to the informal informational hearings taking place before the UN World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, scheduled for September 22nd through 23. And on this opening day, it was actually a very eventful morning. The President of the General Assembly showed up to be able to explain a little clearer his roadmap. But more importantly, the discussions began and Indigenous peoples as well as governments were able to put forward their positions on the outcome document. The first panel actually featured Daly Sambo as the chair of the Permanent Forum, and she kicked off the discussion on implementation on the rights of Indigenous peoples. Daly spoke about the gap between the Declaration and the rights enshrined, and more importantly, the lack of implementation in countries and communities around the world. Many governments also spoke about their desire to improve upon the situation and circumstances, and many also reinforced that the ALTA outcome document should be the basis for the outcome document for the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. What was also very important and significant was also what came up from Indigenous peoples from the 7 regions. The first thing came up was there must be a mechanism to implement the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Some ideas and mentions were looking at all the instruments that exist and even the idea of a new one. Another instrument that also was brought up was the optional protocol that has been raised and how that could be voluntarily accepted by states, and one way that people could look at implementing the Declaration. Other important issues that came up was violence against women and children, and another important one that came up was looking at even a special rapporteur on violence against Indigenous women and youth. So there's many different ideas coming up. More importantly though, they all reinforced one another to make sure that implementation must be a reality, that we can't just have a declaration that was adopted in 2007 with no real changes on the ground. Another idea that did come up was a third decade and the push for that to make sure it just focus on implementation. One important aspect though was really the UN specialized agencies, programs and funds and their ideas and what they offered of how they should work closer to be able to make sure that Indigenous rights are implemented. The second half of the day was focusing on lands, territories, resources, oceans and waters. And that began with Francisco Calle, the first Indigenous chair of a UN human rights treaty body. And he was able to speak about the importance of land and more importantly the challenges for land, mainly corporations that are coming and moving in on Indigenous peoples' lands. And many Indigenous peoples echoed many of the points early in the morning, but also looked at other issues to guarantee lands, territories and resources, of maybe an Under Secretary General or an Assistant Secretary General looking at Indigenous peoples' rights and affairs. And so what's really important though on this first day was you could really see one voice of Indigenous peoples from all the regions focusing on just a handful of important instruments and initiatives that will be able to make sure that the Declaration is moving beyond a dialogue but actually doing things for Indigenous peoples around the world. So this is our first day. It's quite exciting to see that, and we'll let you know what happens tomorrow on the last panel and then also what the next steps will be. Aloha and thank you.